the war had ended. The Allies had triumphed, and the Axis powers had capitulated. Yet, in the aftermath of World War II, a strange stillness settled over the once bustling landscapes of Europe, North America, and beyond. For all its devastation and disruption, the war's cessation was not a return to normalcy. Instead, it introduced a new set of complications, where peace presented its own set of challenges. The economic priorities shifted abruptly, and military installations, once the vital nodes of wartime operations, found themselves exposed to a world that no longer required them. Among the most striking of these abandoned or repurposed installations were the enormous radar stations built during the war. These massive structures, designed to detect incoming aircraft and provide early warning of enemy bombers or fighters, were a critical part of wartime defense systems. Yet, once the immediate threat of aerial combat had dissipated, these radar installations, often colossal in scale, faced an uncertain fate. They were a product of a world at war, now obsolete relics in a time of peace. In Europe, the Allied victory had not only resulted in the collapse of the Axis powers but also a dramatic shift in the balance of power. The radar stations, built across the continent, were once critical to defending against the Luftwaffe and later, Soviet aerial threats. But the world after 1945 was marked by an intense economic struggle, as nations turned their attention from the production of war machines to the reconstruction of their economies. For many, the huge radar arrays, some towering hundreds of feet, were no longer needed in the same capacity. These stations, from the radar domes perched atop remote hills to the sprawling complexes hidden in forests and coastal cliffs, now stood as silent monuments to a bygone era. The cost of maintaining such vast systems was prohibitive. These stations were not just small outposts, they were complex, costly installations, often requiring heavy equipment, skilled personnel, and substantial resources to operate. For many of the countries involved, the cost of upkeep outweighed any conceivable benefit. The transition to peacetime economies brought with it a harsh reality. Resources had to be allocated carefully, and maintaining large, costly radar installations was increasingly seen as a luxury they could ill afford. The war had exhausted resources, and now nations were in the midst of rebuilding infrastructure, re-establishing industries, and attending to the basic needs of their citizens. The first decisions came swiftly. In the United Kingdom, the British government quickly realized that maintaining the costly and expansive radar network built during the war was untenable. In 1945, immediately after victory, the Ministry of Defense began to scale down operations, decommissioning many radar sites. The government had initially sought to preserve the most strategic sites, particularly those along the eastern coastline, where tensions with the Soviet Union were rising. Yet, even these were soon reduced, and by the early 1950s, much of the wartime radar infrastructure had been dismantled or left to rot in the elements. Some sites were repurposed for civilian use, often as weather stations or communications hubs, but the majority were abandoned. In the United States, the situation was no different. The wartime radar systems that had been critical to the defense of the East Coast against German and Japanese bombers were no longer necessary. With the end of the war, the United States entered a new period of military restructuring. The end of hostilities brought about a drastic reduction in military spending, with many installations closing down or being abandoned entirely. The sheer size of some of these radar installations made their continued use impractical, especially given the new developments in radar technology and air defense systems that emerged in the late 1940s. Smaller, more efficient systems began to replace the large-scale radar stations that had once been the backbone of the wartime defense strategy. In the wake of the war, a combination of logistical and political considerations led to the rapid dismantling of the radar infrastructure in countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan. These nations, particularly in the case of Germany, faced not only the challenges of rebuilding from the war's devastation but also the constraints of the Allied occupation. In the years immediately following the end of the war, the Allies imposed strict controls over Germany's military capabilities. Many of the large radar sites constructed by the Nazis for the defense of the Reich were dismantled as part of the broader effort to ensure that the country would not pose a future threat. The Allies dismantled or destroyed radar stations across Germany, and in many cases, entire networks of radar systems were rendered inoperable. Yet, the fate of the radar stations varied widely depending on the country, the strategic importance of the site, and the resources available for repurposing or dismantling the equipment. In the Soviet Union, for example, many radar stations were retained or repurposed. As tensions between the East and West escalated into the Cold War, the Soviet Union saw a renewed need for aerial defense systems. Some of the enormous radar stations built during the war, which had been designed to defend against German bombers, were modified and expanded for new purposes. These installations, though not as widespread as those in the United States or the UK, remained an important part of the Soviet defense infrastructure through the early Cold War years. On the other hand, in some parts of occupied Europe, radar stations were simply abandoned. The post-war economic strain was too much for many countries to address the vast costs associated with maintaining these sites. In areas where the war's impact had been particularly devastating, such as France and Italy, the reconstruction of civilian infrastructure took precedence over military concerns. This resulted in many radar sites being left to fall into disrepair, their equipment rusting and decaying in the elements. Some of the largest and most prominent sites, such as those located along the French coast, became forgotten ruins, little more than skeletal remains of the war effort. The scale of abandonment was staggering. Thousands of miles of radar equipment, once spread across the European landscape, from the coasts of the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from Britain's shores to Germany's borders, were either dismantled, destroyed, or left to deteriorate. In some cases, the dismantling of the radar stations was immediate and complete, with equipment sent to scrap yards or sold for other purposes. In others, the stations were simply left standing, their equipment eventually becoming obsolete and unfit for modern use. The process of scrapping these installations was no simple task. Radar stations were often located in remote or difficult-to-access areas, making dismantling challenging. The heavy machinery required to disassemble the stations was not always available, and in many instances, the equipment was simply abandoned, left to rust and decay. Yet, in some cases, the materials from these installations were repurposed. Copper and steel from the radar systems were often salvaged for use in civilian industries, particularly as the demand for metal soared in the immediate post-war years. At the same time, some of the larger, more strategic radar sites were repurposed for new uses. In the United States, the growing Cold War tensions led to some radar stations being converted into early warning centers for nuclear defense. Similarly, in the UK, some of the radar stations were adapted for new technological purposes, including the development of civilian air traffic control systems. But despite these efforts, the fate of most radar stations in the immediate post-war years was one of decay and abandonment. The logistical difficulties of maintaining such enormous and specialized installations, combined with the broader economic pressures of post-war reconstruction, led to the rapid dismantling of these structures. The enormous radar stations that had once been the pinnacle of wartime defense now stood as remnants of a past conflict, their role in history diminishing as quickly as the technological advancements of the Cold War outpaced the systems they had once supported. By the early 1950s, the radar stations of World War II were largely consigned to history. Some still stood, silent and imposing, on remote hillsides and abandoned airfields, but their purpose had faded. These vast installations, built to detect the enemy's approach, now faced the slow erosion of time, and their once critical role in the defense of nations had been reduced to the rusting skeletons of a bygone era. The post-war era saw significant shifts in the fate of the massive radar installations constructed during World War II. While many of these structures were dismantled or abandoned, some found new life as they were repurposed or adapted to meet the demands of a changing world. Yet, even in the cases where these stations were given new uses, they stood as a reminder of a time when the world was in the throes of global conflict, and the demands of war had shaped not only the landscape but also the very technologies that were meant to protect nations. In many cases, the radar stations that were repurposed became part of the burgeoning Cold War infrastructure. As the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies prepared for the potential of nuclear war, the need for an integrated defense system that could detect missile launches and airborne threats became increasingly apparent. Radar, once built to track conventional bombers and fighter aircraft, was now being adapted to detect the far more complex and rapid-moving threats of the new era, intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear bombers. As a result, many of the abandoned radar stations were revived for this purpose, although the technology itself had to undergo significant upgrades. The United States, having demobilized much of its wartime infrastructure, began to shift its focus towards Cold War defense. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the first elements of the DW line, Distant Early Warning Line, were constructed, a network of radar stations designed to detect Soviet bombers attempting to cross the Arctic Circle. Many of the former World War II radar sites, particularly those in the northern regions of Canada and Alaska, were transformed into critical parts of this network. These sites, initially built with limited technology, were modernized and expanded to meet the new strategic needs of the U.S. military. The radar domes and towers, which had once stood as symbols of a war-torn world, were now integrated into a broader surveillance network that spanned the continent. At the same time, the SAGE, semi-automatic ground environment, system was developed in the United States, an early air defense system designed to integrate radar stations across the country into a real-time control center for the interception of hostile aircraft. Some of the radar stations from World War II were incorporated into this system, which was intended to provide a coordinated defense against Soviet bombers. This transition marked the beginning of a new chapter in the life of these stations. Though their original purpose had been to detect conventional aircraft, they were now part of an advanced warning system for nuclear war. The Cold War also prompted a different sort of technological development in radar systems. During the late 1950s and 1960s, radar technology was rapidly improving, and new systems capable of tracking missiles and fast-moving aircraft were developed. As a result, many of the older radar stations built during World War II, which were designed to detect slower-moving bombers, were considered obsolete. The upgrade from conventional radar to more specialized missile tracking systems meant that many of the vast radar complexes built during the war were decommissioned in favor of more advanced technology. In the United Kingdom, the Ministry of Defence continued to rely on the radar installations that had been part of the Royal Air Force's defence network during the war. However, by the early 1950s, much of the wartime radar infrastructure was becoming increasingly inadequate for the new technological demands of the Cold War. As a result, the British government made the decision to replace many of these stations with newer radar systems capable of detecting modern threats. Some of the older sites were repurposed as part of the UK's early warning network or were used for civilian purposes, but many were simply abandoned or left to decay. In Germany, the post-war fate of the radar stations was more complex. While the Allied occupation forces dismantled many of the radar systems that had been constructed by the Nazis, some were retained for use in the newly established West German military. The Bundeswehr, or West German Army, began to develop its own air defense infrastructure, and some of the wartime radar stations were updated and integrated into the new military framework. In some cases, the radar systems were adapted to serve as part of the NATO defense network, particularly along the Iron Curtain, where the risk of a Soviet air assault was high. Yet, as was the case in other parts of Europe, the rapid advancement of radar and missile technology made many of these older stations obsolete. Despite the technological advances of the Cold War, there remained a degree of nostalgia and reverence for the World War II radar systems that had once been so essential to the defense of nations. In certain circles, the enormous radar towers and domes, though now irrelevant in terms of their original purpose, were seen as symbols of resilience and the technological triumph of the wartime era. For some, they became reminders of the ingenuity that had been required to build such massive structures in the face of constant aerial bombardment. Others viewed the sites as reminders of the human cost of war, as the immense resources and manpower that had gone into constructing and maintaining these systems could never be recovered. In some parts of Europe, particularly in France and Italy, the remains of these radar stations became part of the post-war landscape. Abandoned and overgrown, they stood as eerie monuments to a conflict that had torn the continent apart. For many, these decaying structures were symbols of the immense sacrifices made during the war. In some areas, the radar installations became tourist attractions, as their historical significance drew visitors seeking to learn about the war and its aftermath. Yet, for the most part, the fate of these radar installations was one of gradual decay and obsolescence. The advances in radar technology, coupled with the shifting priorities of the Cold War, meant that many of these structures were no longer necessary. Even when repurposed, their role in modern defense systems was often minimal. The rapid evolution of technology meant that new systems were constantly replacing the old, and many of the sites were ultimately abandoned as military assets. Even those that remained operational eventually succumbed to the pressures of time and obsolescence. As the years passed, the once proud radar stations of the wartime era faded into history. In the late 20th century, as the Cold War wound down and the threat of a global nuclear conflict receded, many of the former radar stations were decommissioned entirely. The end of the Cold War and the subsequent reduction in military spending led to the dismantling of many of the last remaining radar stations. Some were simply destroyed or left to fall into ruin, while others were converted for civilian purposes. In some cases, radar sites were repurposed for telecommunications or broadcasting, though the massive infrastructure originally built to track enemy aircraft or missiles was no longer needed for such functions.